Welcome to As the Key Turns. I'm David Lehman, and this is part 2 of my multi-part series on the regrets of Thomas Silverstein. Now, if you haven't watched the first part, I recommend highly that you do, because the second part is just starting at the beginning of one of his chapters of his plea to get out of solitary confinement. And if you don't watch the first part, the second part just doesn't make as much sense. So, if you haven't, stop right here, go back and watch part 1.
USP Leavenworth, the basement cell. When I finally arrived at the new prison, I learned I was at USP Leavenworth. I was not allowed to wash myself until I was placed in a special cell in the basement. This happened on December the 1st, 1987. I thought that maybe, after seeing that I was non-violent even when I had the chance during the riot, the BOP would start to lessen my restrictions, but I was wrong. I was crushed when I saw my new cell in the Leavenworth basement. To get to the basement cell, numerous officers in protective armor escorted me down a small elevator to the basement and through an underground tunnel in the 85-year-old building. It felt like going into a dungeon. On the day I arrived at Leavenworth, Associate Warden Smith visited my cell. Smith had been Correctional Officer Klutz's friend. He was now in charge of my confinement. He told me that he was going to do all he could to prevent me from seeing the light of day, and that I deserved everything that I was getting. Indeed, I didn't see the light of day for a long time. I did not receive any recreation at all for nearly a year at Leavenworth. Instead, prison staff slowly began adding more bars and constructing an adjacent visiting booth and indoor recreation area so that I would never have to leave the basement. The structure of the basement cell itself was similar to the side pocket cell in USP Atlanta. The cell area was approximately 9 foot by 16 foot and contained a bed, desk, a metal sink, shower stall, TV, shower, and toilet without a lid. Soon after I arrived, they installed several cameras into the basement. After this, I was kept under camera surveillance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Knowing that I was constantly being watched, even while using the toilet or taking a shower, was embarrassing and made me extremely anxious. One of the cameras was installed right over the toilet. I suffered from serious hemorrhoids for as long as I can remember. It was humiliating to know the officers were likely talking about me and mocking me as I tried to blot the blood flowing from my rear. Below is my artistic rendering of the camera's placement in relation to my toilet and how I felt being watched. The cell was brightly lit at all times. I was told this was in order for the cameras to show a clear picture. Sometimes the BOP would even put a spotlight and shine it on me directly, blinding me. There was nothing I could do to stop the light. With the light on all the time, I never slept more than 4 or 5 hours. This was made even worse by the fact that there was no window, as in the side pocket my body could not tell whether it was night or day. Additionally, my vision continued to deteriorate, and sometimes I would have hallucinations where the bars on the cell moved, or I saw different shapes. The privileges my good behavior had earned me in USP Atlanta were taken from me in Leavenworth, including my art supplies. In the absence of human contact, my art had become central to my identity. It was almost the only way I knew I was alive, that I existed. No one spoke to me, but I felt that I was able to communicate that I was a living human being by making art. Without it, I felt like a part of my soul had been taken from me. I was also not allowed a razor or any means of cutting my hair for 6 months upon arriving in Leavenworth. When I was finally permitted to use a razor, my beard and hair were so long that it was not of much use, so I didn't bother. I did not have access to a mirror. Only years later, when I asked to see a photo of myself, could I see what I looked like. I didn't recognize the person underneath the overgrown head of hair and unkempt beard. The basement cell completely isolated me from all other inmates. I never saw or heard any sign of any other prisoners. It is hard to convey how strange it is to be isolated in a prison, to see and hear no sign of other prisoners. Prisons are generally noisy and filled with sounds of other prisoners. Proximity with others is typically a defining characteristic of prison. Yet, in the basement cell, I lived in what seemed a post-apocalyptic solitary state. I felt utterly alone. The basement cell also minimized my contact with staff. The two officers who were outside my cell never directly spoke to me. At the same time, just like in Atlanta, their conversations and blaring music tormented me and kept me up at all hours. Sometimes they would put a phone just outside of my cell and would call it on purpose so that it would ring and ring for hours just to torment me. I often received fewer than 3 meals a day, and I ate every meal alone. I was not allowed any recreation privileges and never left my cell. For approximately my first year in the basement, I had no hot water and was forced to take cold showers. I only received hot water after Leavenworth staff realized I could not adequately clean my cell. The scum in my shower grew so thick, I wrote the word freedom in it using my finger. When staff ordered me to wash the word off, I explained that I had no hot water to use for cleaning. Thus, for the purpose of cleaning my graffiti, I was finally allowed hot water. At first, I was not permitted any art supplies. I filed grievances about this, which were denied all the way up to BP 11, the highest level. After a year in the basement cell, my art supplies were finally returned to me. I believe the reason I received them back was because an outsider, the writer Pete Early, was in the prison and asked the warden why I was not allowed art supplies. Below is the first picture I drew once my art supplies were returned. It shows a man prostrate, depleted, and defeated. I think the work speaks for itself. The basement cell was infested with vermin. I often awoke to find rats and cockroaches crawling in my hair and beard. Despite this, I became careful not to injure my fellow basement dwellers because they were my only companions. In addition, because I was learning and studying Buddhism, I began thinking of and valuing life in a different way. I felt like my head was in a constant fog when I was in the basement cell. I was never tired enough to sleep and yet lacked energy to do anything. During my time in the basement, I never left my cell. I did not breathe fresh air or glimpse any sunlight. In that whole time, I did not touch another person, and no one touched me, not even the officers, as I was never allowed to leave my cell. I actually began to feel and think of myself like a leper or some other untouchable, as if I were not fit to be around people because I would infect anyone I came into contact with. The only time anyone spoke to me was during occasional rounds made by administrators, religious chaplains, and a monthly visit from the prison psychologist. These interactions lasted typically only a matter of seconds. I received no reviews for the 18 months I was held in the basement cell. On rare occasions, when someone would visit my cell, I would ask about what I could do to get out of solitary. They always responded that they were just checking to see that I was receiving meals, recreation, and appropriate programming. I was always told they had no authority to change the conditions of my confinement and I needed to speak to the warden. Leavenworth, the Silverstein Suite. After approximately 18 months in the basement cell and without notice, I was chained and shackled to a wheelchair and escorted to a new cell. The new cell, previously known as the Hole, was in the same building as the Leavenworth Special Housing Unit, SHU. The officers ironically called this cell the Silverstein Suite. Even though I was technically in the SHU, I could not see or hear any other prisoners The area where I was held was accessed by a separate entrance. Even when I listened at the vent, I could not hear anything. Yet sometimes pepper gas would come through my vents and would burn my eyes and throat. For a long time, I thought the officer sprayed the gas into the vent just to cause me pain. Later, however, I figured out that the gas was coming through when it was used on prisoners in the SHU. In the Silverstein Suite, I remained on a, quote, no human contact, unquote, status and continued to be isolated. The Silverstein Suite consisted of a cell area, an area devoted to conducting strip searches, and recreation areas, one outdoor and one indoor. The indoor recreation area was also used as a visiting area. The areas were separated by solid steel doors. To move between areas, prison staff would remotely open these to allow me to pass through. The outdoor recreation area was approximately 17 feet by 14 foot 6 inches and surrounded by 20-foot high concrete walls. The sky above the walls was blocked by a roof built out of 2 sets of wire bars and mesh. I could see nothing of the surrounding landscape or even the sky from the outdoor recreation area. In the Silverstein Suite, I was allowed to exercise 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, in the outdoor recreation area. Sometimes I was left in the outdoor recreation area for extended periods of time during the winter in the bitter cold, snow, or rain. The indoor recreation area was opposite the outdoor recreation and strip search areas. It was approximately 9 foot by 16 foot and contained a broken stationary bike, a concrete stool, intercom, and a glassed barred window that looked out into a visiting booth. 2 surveillance cameras watched everything I did in the Silverstein Suite, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I imagined eyes on me all the time. As I moved around the cell, the cameras would make a buzzing noise as they readjusted to see me. Again, it was humiliating to have to go to the bathroom or treat my hemorrhoids knowing the camera was always on me. During my time in the Silverstein Suite, I was always alone. I exercised alone and took all my meals alone. Lights remained on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the Silverstein Suite. A year or two before I was transferred from Leavenworth to the ADX, the prison installed a switch that allowed me to turn off the light in my cell. However, I still could not make it fully dark as the light in the hall remained on 24 hours a day. Initially, I was only allowed 1 phone call a month. However, my phone privileges increased over time, and by 2001 I was allowed about 300 minutes a month. Below is a drawing of me I made while in the Silverstein Suite that depicts how I made phone calls. During my time in the Silverstein Suite, prison psychology staff conducted drive-by visits, pausing only briefly at my cell before moving on. When my psychologist, Dr. Denny, came to speak, it would generally be only for a few minutes, and these conversations always happened through a solid steel door. Often he didn't come at all, and I later learned that he conducted his psychological review by watching me on the cameras that constantly filmed me. I often expressed hopelessness and depression to the psychologist. I desperately tried to explain that my poor emotional state grew directly from my solitary confinement. I told Dr. Denny about how I couldn't sleep and how I was losing my memory. I asked him to help me, and I asked him to test me. However, Dr. Denny refused to take any action. He told me my feelings and symptoms were normal for someone in these conditions, but I had the impression that he thought that he would lose his job if he intervened or recommended that I be removed from solitary confinement. He would tell me, "I have a family to feed." Later, when I saw the reports, I discovered he didn't even write down much of what I told him. After numerous failed attempts to get Dr. Denny to help me, I concluded it was pointless to continue, so I stopped talking to most of the psychology staff altogether. It was frustrating to express my vulnerability to someone who would not change his response no matter how I was doing. On rare occasions, about twice a year, I had reviews with people other than Dr. Denny. I saw Ms. Ashman more frequently, but definitely not more than a few times every couple of months or so. In order to attend these reviews, I was chained to a wheelchair and escorted to the meetings, which were held only a few feet from my cell. During these reviews, I always inquired about what I needed to do to get out of solitary confinement. In response, administrators, including the case manager, the region representative, and the warden, informed me that they were not there to make decisions about my confinement or placement, but simply to see that I was getting meals, recreation, and mail, and discouraged me from continuing to ask questions about my confinement. After many years of these reviews, without any change in my conditions, I saw no point in attending, and so I began refusing to attend. At this point, administrators began coming to my cell door to conduct the reviews, which continued to be meaningless for me. During the years I was in the Silverstein Suite, I was almost never taken out of my cell. On the rare occasion that I was taken out, I was escorted by many correctional officers in riot gear. Below is my artistic rendering of my being taken to the prison hospital for a dental checkup. Buddhism and yoga helped me deal with my conditions and simultaneously helped me change as a person. I learned that all I can control is my reactions to what happens, and that no matter how hard I try, I can't control other people. Though I still suffered when the BOP failed to move me to less restrictive conditions year after year despite my good behavior, I tried to control my reactions to this inaction. In addition, practicing yoga helped calm my anxiety and helped me develop a greater sense of inner peace. I spent the next 15 years in the Silverstein Suite, with 2 short stints back in the basement cell when the suite needed to be painted or otherwise maintained. This is a picture I drew in 1994 after 11 years in solitary confinement. ADX, Range 13. On July 15, 2005, without any notice or explanation, I was transferred to the Administrative Maximum Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado. No one ever talked to me about transferring to ADX, so I was unaware this was going to happen until the very morning the transfer took place. The day of my transfer, I awoke at 5 in the morning to a bunch of officers in full protective gear outside my cell. I figured out quickly that this meant I was going to move. I was taken to a van where I was shuffled from one cage to the next. The entire way, I was hoping this transfer meant change for the better. I soon realized it was not. When we arrived at ADX, I was immediately taken to the hospital and x-rayed. I was then hustled through long, sterile corridors with floors that gleamed. We passed through door after door until finally we arrived at Range 13. Range 13 is located on Z Unit, which is part of the SHU at ADX. I continued to be held on a, quote, no human contact status, unquote, on Range 13, the most restrictive housing unit in the most restrictive federal penitentiary in the country. I would not have thought this was possible, but Range 13, the conditions were even worse than Leavenworth. My cell was even smaller, and I lost many of the privileges that had helped me endure the isolation, like art supplies and phone calls. There are 4 cells on Range 13, and I was rotated between 2 cells every 3 months. There was only one other person held on Range 13. After 22 years of not being able to speak to another inmate, I was excited to have the opportunity to talk to anyone. Even though we had to shout at each other, and it was difficult to hear what the other person said back, it was still nice to be able to hear your own voice in conversation and a friendly voice replying. However, the officers ordered us not to talk to each other and even threatened us with disciplinary report if we did talk. Pretty quickly after my arrival, a solid steel door was built in the hallways to further separate us and prevent us from being able to shout to each other. In some ways, knowing someone else was nearby and in similar conditions made me feel better. Just knowing there was someone else who understood a little bit of what I went through each day made me feel better somehow. The cells on Range 13 were about 8 foot 6 inches by 10 foot, almost half the size of my cell in Leavenworth. Each contained a cement bed with metal restraint rings, a cement desk, sink, toilet, and shower. In one cell, the walls were cement, and I had a mirror and a small horizontal window near the ceiling that I could look out if I stood on my desk. I could only see the concrete barriers of the outdoor workout area. I couldn't even see the sky. In the other cell, the walls were made of steel and there was no mirror. There was a window, however. I couldn't see out the window because it was covered in mesh that had been painted over, making it difficult even for light to shine in. Even though I could dim my cell light, I could never turn it completely off. In addition, the lights in the sally ports of both cells were on 24 hours a day. I was still continuously monitored by video surveillance cameras. Being watched all the time made me feel like I lived in a petri dish, like I'm the bacteria under the BOP's microscope. I used to become extremely apprehensive whenever I heard the officers thrust the grill gate key into the lock to enter Range 13. The noise from unlocking the gate isn't very loud, but I have become extremely sensitive to noises. Many of the privileges that I had been given over time at Leavenworth were denied at ADX. For example, my phone time was decreased from 300 minutes a month to 2 15-minute phone calls a month, and I was no longer allowed to send art out to many people who I corresponded with by mail. I was not given an explanation for any of why my limited ability to communicate with people was being further restricted. I was also deprived of all my art supplies except a pencil and paper. I take my art very seriously, and being an artist is what defines me, so it was extremely difficult to find myself suddenly without my art supplies. I felt as if a significant piece of me was missing. In December 2007, after almost 2.5 years, a very limited amount of art supplies was returned to me, for which I am very thankful. However, even to this day, I still am limited to only 6 watercolors and am not allowed any other types of paint, which I had access to in Leavenworth. On Range 13, I was allowed to use one of 2 outdoor recreation areas which were connected to the cells via remote-operated doors. The outdoor recreation area was a concrete pit surrounded by high, featureless walls on all sides. It felt like being inside of a deep, empty swimming pool. I couldn't see any of the mountains, even though I knew they had to be close by. I also couldn't see a single tree, a blade of grass, or any sign of nature. This picture is a true and accurate representation of one of the outdoor recreation areas I used while I was in Range 13. I was also allowed to use an indoor recreation area which was connected to the cells via remote-operated doors. I generally received 1 hour of recreation time 5 days a week. The recreation areas were so small that I could walk no more than 10 steps in either direction and 30 steps in a circle. There was no equipment in the recreation areas. During the time I was confined on Range 13, I ate every meal alone in my cell and exercised by myself. My meals were usually late and almost always cold. Every 30 days, the psychology staff would conduct a mental health interview, which usually lasted only minutes. This meeting took place by talking through the solid steel door. This picture is a true and accurate representation of the steel door through which my mental health interviews took place, and it's blank. Sometimes staff would walk into the sally port, but they were always accompanied by armed correctional officers. These meetings did not last more than a few minutes. The psychology staff would ask me how I was feeling, and I would try to answer honestly, but it seems as though they were not really listening and just waiting for a few minutes to pass before they could leave. While I was on Range 13, I left my cell only for infrequent haircuts and semi-annual reviews. When I was taken out of my cell, I was subject to an invasive strip search and handcuffed and shackled to a black box suspended by chains around my waist. My ankles were also shackled. every time I was escorted by at least 3 officers. I hated having my hair cut because it meant someone would be standing behind me touching me. Even though these lasted only 10 minutes, it made me so anxious I would start to shake uncontrollably. Getting my hair cut still has this effect on me. As much as I am happy to be out of my cell, even to walk somewhere in the prison for a haircut, the shackles injure my hands. The black box in particular prevents movement by cutting into my wrist. I sometimes request to see medical staff because my wrists are bleeding following these trips. When I was returned to my cell on Range 13, I was once again strip searched. These invasive, humiliating strip searches and infrequent haircuts were the only physical human contact I had on Range 13. In 2006, I began receiving semi-annual reviews with Warden Wiley, the NCR director, and the CPD assistant. I never received notice before these reviews occurred, so I had never had an opportunity to prepare any arguments or evidence. I never knew what kind of criteria was used to evaluate me, or even if there were any standards or guidelines used. I repeatedly asked what I needed to do to be removed out of Range 13. In response, I was told to just keep doing what I was doing. These reviews usually only lasted a few minutes, just long enough for them to ask me a few questions. These reviews were held in person. However, the reviews still always told me that they couldn't move me, but were just checking on me.
All right, I just had a few comments about what Silverstein was talking about. The only thing is like some clarifications. He talked about restraint rings in his concrete bed. I'm standing right here on a concrete slab that poured recently. And what happens is they make a bed, which is, I don't know, about 3 foot wide, slightly wider, and 7 foot long. And in it, there's a portion that's dug out, I guess is how you'd say it, or there's no concrete. Maybe it's so deep. And inside that has a piece of metal that goes across it. So in other words, it's like a cup with a bar going across it. And what we use those for is when an inmate needs to be restrained, we call it four-pointing him, where his hands are like right here and his feet are both restrained, shoulder width apart on the edges of the bed. We do that with handcuffs, and then there's a thing called soft restraints, which are something about so wide, it goes around the wrist, and we place handcuffs through it so it holds his wrist, but it's much easier on you than the steel of a handcuff, and we four-point him to a bed. And in that case, and it happens fairly often in a Supermax prison like ADX or Marion, where an inmate just goes amok, and either for his safety and or ours, he has to be four-pointed. That's what we do. So just thought that I would clarify what he's talking about there. And then he talks about being moved from one place to another in a type of restraints that we handcuff an individual in front of himself, like this. He's handcuffed this way. In these handcuffs, there's a chain. We call them a dog chain, but they're really not. They're a light chain, and they go all the way around the individual. And I like to put mine through the belt loop in the back of his pants so that he can't slip it down easily. And then there's a plastic thing so big that goes over the handcuffs so that he can't get to the keyways. And then this chain is looped up through that and secured on his side with a padlock so he can't get at it, because what he does is he can only do this. He could reach his mouth and he could sign things and stuff like that. He can move slightly. But if he goes to turn, the padlock turns as well and he can't get at it. And he can't get at the keyways. And then of course we put leg irons on him, so he has to walk like this the whole time that he's restrained in this manner. And it restricts his movement so that he don't stab any of us to death or attempt to escape or whatever. It's used in many instances, usually during transport, one way or another, or if you're like him and have a three-man hold on you, that's the kind of way that we would transport you across from this wall to right there is the shower at USP Marion, and I would have to strip search an inmate, place him in those restraints, walk him across the hallway, put him inside this shower, and remove all the restraints. That was the kind of security that we had on inmates at Marion, and I'm sure they did the same thing at the ADX. So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about these restraints and these restraint devices. Just thought I'd clarify that for you.